Welcome to the Applied Rationality podcast. This is video 4, where we're going to talk about good skepticism and bad skepticism. In this episode, I want to fundamentally make the point that not all of science is just skepticism. There is good skepticism, and unfortunately, there is way too much bad skepticism. So when I say good skepticism and bad skepticism, what do I mean? Well, I think we all have some experience with bad skepticism. You've got a bunch of high-quality sources of information on some topic, and you're presenting them to somebody, trying to get them to change their mind about whatever it is, and rather than pay attention to the sources and update their beliefs based on this new information, they simply deny the validity of the sources. You encounter bad skepticism most often when interacting with conspiracy theorists, like, for instance, Sandy Hook hoaxers and flat earthers. Sandy Hook hoaxers seem like they would, like to not have to confront the possibility that gun control might save children's lives, and instead they'd rather just believe that the whole thing was made up, that it was a fiction acted out by child actors. Flat earthers seem to want to just believe that all of science is a conspiracy. You can show them photographs of a spherical Earth taken by NASA or lots of other evidence, and again, they have a belief that they are trying to maintain. They want to, reach this conclusion, and they will simply deny all evidence that gets in the way of that. Now, in these two cases and many more, conspiracy theorists want to deny information from these trustworthy institutions and claim that in so doing, they are being good scientific skeptics. Often they like to portray themselves that way. But when you look at what they have to say, you find that they are in fact not skeptical about everything. If you look at the kinds of things that they do accept evidence from biblical passages, for example. They'll accept certain websites that spread known falsehoods, and they will, use blogs maintained by unaccountable anonymous people as sources of information in a conversation to prove their point. So while I think we have to kind of grant that in a certain sense they are skeptics, they are in fact bad skeptics. Skepticism is not supposed to be, or at least good skepticism, is not a rejection of absolutely everything. It is supposed to be a filter that discerns the good from the bad. Of course, that provokes the question, what makes a source good? Now, that can be a very complicated thing to try to answer, but we can at least give some fairly sensible guidelines. For one thing, they should have explicit procedures, right? Journalistic procedures are excellent, academic procedures, things like interviewing everybody who is associated with a story, something that most blogs don't do. You also can cross-check records against public documents to make sure that everybody's story is consistent. Also, they'll tend to make statements that can be independently verified by other auditors and investigators. So, for instance, if one news network says that so-and-so, says that they were a witness to the crime, someone else can go and investigate that same person. Hopefully their name is known to everyone, at least among journalists, right? For safety reasons, you don't always share people's names with the public, but they have some method of having kind of cross-validation so that some independent investigator can get the same results. If you go around saying things that either are contradicted by every other news network, like, for instance, that there was no violence on January the 6th at the Capitol, or if you go around saying things that simply aren't amenable to independent investigators, like, I don't know, there are Jewish space lasers or something like that, that cannot possibly be checked by anybody because no matter where you look, you could just say, well, that's not the particular place where the Jewish space lasers are, then that's just not amenable to independent investigation, and so that's not a particularly trustworthy source either. A particularly valuable and telling thing is that when an institution or an organization or a particular individual is checked by independent investigators and there turns out to be some discrepancies, some mistakes were made, the institution will admit wrong and, change their behavior in the future. In fact, this is one of the things that I particularly love about NPR. I have repeatedly noticed that they make small mistakes, get certain facts and details wrong, sometimes not entirely small mistakes, and they will, days later, when the mistakes are pointed out by listeners or whatever, they will talk about how they got something wrong. Well, that actually increases my trust because that tells me that they are accountable and that they really care about the truth. So some example sources that I would regard as trustworthy, and this is a little bit of opinion, but I think that I can make the case, right? If pressed on any one of these, I can argue that NPR, The Atlantic, and The Economist are all instances where they rate highly on every one of the virtues that I listed above. Sources which score low include Fox News, Cenk Uygur, Breitbart, and just about every single social media account, with rare exception. And let me be clear, when I say this, when I am talking about trusting these sources and trusting these institutions, I am not saying that you take everything that they say on faith. I am not saying that if some organization or person that I trust tells me something, I simply believe it. I do not question it. I do not express any doubt. I don't do further investigation. That is not what trust means. Trust is something that comes in degrees, like so many things, right? Your belief in things should come in degrees. You should never fully believe something because there is always some chance that you got it wrong. Well, also, you should never trust anything 100%. Your trust should come in degrees. And so when I say that I trust these institutions, it just means that I have a high degree of trust. When they say something, I tend to give it a lot of weight. I tend to lean towards believing it. And when, these other institutions that I do not trust say something, then I generally regard it as just as good as if I hadn't heard it, because I just don't think that what they say tends to correlate with that thing being true and reliable. So, but this is just rates, right? I'm not necessarily saying that if something I trust reports something, I instantly believe it. That's not correct. And I'm also not saying that any of these less trustworthy or not trustworthy examples are things where if they say it, then I simply don't believe it. That's also not true, because they do say correct things sometimes, just not often enough for me to regard them as when they say something, I give it weight. That's how distrusting something works. And I just want to say this because I can already predict that if anybody sees and responds to this who comes from a more sort of like rightward orientation, they're going to regard these sources as laughable or whatever. And I think a lot of people don't really argue for objective sources, don't argue the case that their sources are objective, because I feel like we're all kind of tired of that kind of argument. We've been through it so many times where one person brings out these sources and another person says they're invalid because they have some kind of a bias, and we're just not interested. We're tired of that kind of argumentation. But I actually think that especially in a time when we simply cannot agree on the facts, actually perhaps the most important fight to have, the most important thing to try to get us to agree on and cooperate on, is what it is to be a good source and which sources are the trustworthy ones, so that we can start to share again some body of facts. So I personally am trying to maintain a policy that if anybody wants to press me on the quality of some particular source, I will have that argument. I will give my reasons for thinking that a particular source is a good source, and will press a person on why they think it's bad and what it is to, right, like what standards of judgment should we have for sources. I find that often people think that a source is a good source if it says the kinds of things they already believe, and that is not the way to judge a good source. That's the way to live inside of an echo chamber. So when you have this argument explicitly, I think you actually can make some progress in agreeing on what it is to be a good source, and then from there try to talk about which sources are good ones. So having laid all of that out, I now want to, somewhat apply these ideas to the question of whether or not Trump was ever a good businessman. I noticed that a lot of Trump supporters simply refuse to listen to any information that goes against the idea that he was, in fact, a bad businessman. And so in that way, they are examples of what I am calling bad skeptics. And so I want to just take this moment to lay out just some basic information from good sources which make, I think, a fairly compelling case that he was never, at any point, a good businessman. So about 10 years ago, The Atlantic ran an article giving some pretty damning facts, and we're going to start with some relatively well-known of the various facts, that in 1991 and 92, Donald Trump declared Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is the legal term which we more commonly call bankruptcy. Now, doing it once is bad enough, but in a way he kind of did it 3 times, all sort of at once, so to speak, in which he declared it on 3 different highly leveraged properties. Highly leveraged means that the amount of the loans was very large relative to the value of the things that the loans were supposed to be invested into so that there would be a future return which could then be used to pay back off the loan. Anyway, but the point is that the loans were massive and the value was not very large. And so that's bad enough, but then even after he declared bankruptcy, he then restructured some existing loans and again declared Chapter 11 in 2004 and in 2009, indicating that over those intervening years, he still had not been able to get his finances such that he was able to pay back those loans. Now, Donald Trump has said in response to people talking and asking about these bankruptcies that Chapter 11 is just something that people in the business world do. He is insinuating, I don't think he's completely explicitly confessing because he does this a lot. He tries to hedge his language and be vague so that he can dodge the law a bit, but basically, what he is insinuating is that his declaration of Chapter 11 is a legal maneuver so that he can cheat on his loans and not have to pay them back. Now, that might be correct, but he's caught in a little bit of a dilemma here because, on the one hand, if he's simply unable to pay the loans back, well, that is a signal of lack of funds and inability to generate the kind of income and revenue that was planned when the loans were taken out. That's one possible interpretation, but here with the suggestion that this was a legally sanctioned cheating maneuver, well, that's also not a flattering picture of a businessman because when you do this, and some people do this, it is known that some people will declare Chapter 11 even when they don't actually have to, but they're basically just trying to not have to pay their loans. When you do this, this makes you extremely untrustworthy and kills a lot of your future business relationships and prospects. So in that way, he now appears to be a bad businessman because this is a kind of career suicide move to make. And in fact, that does seem to be what happened because after he filed all of these bankruptcies, then banks were no longer willing to give him these generous loans for investment. And if they were going to award him any kind of future contracts for building projects, they required him to be extremely personally invested in the project, which he seemed to never do. And that might be because he didn't have the finances. It's not perfectly clear what's going on there. Or it might be because he himself did not believe in his own ability to, recoup, right, like to invest wisely and build back the money from the investment. So maybe even he himself knew that he was a bad businessman. This is all a little bit of speculation, but it's hard to think of many other interpretations of what's going on here. Why wouldn't he personally get invested in these projects? But one way or another, I mean, the case is simply clear that he declared Chapter 11. This allowed him to skip out on his loans, and this seemed to have seriously damaged his reputation, which prevented him from making future deals, and his wealth didn't seem to grow much or possibly at all during this period. Now, there's one other point that I want to make, which is that I think we all agree that being good at business should not count as the same thing as being good at theft, right? So if you earn all of your money by stealing it from other people, well, you might get wealthy, but I don't think we should call you a good businessman. But skipping out on your loans, cheating on your loans, is no different, really, in principle, from theft. I mean, after all, if you take out a loan on the agreement that you will pay it back in the future, and then you simply keep the money and never pay it back, well, in what way is that significantly different from simply taking it in the first place without asking? It seems morally equivalent to theft and no better as far as business practice is concerned. And so if this is really the explanation for why Trump declared Chapter 11, then it still does not attest to a man who's good at business. But then in the late 2000s, it seemed like Trump mustered the will to actually get personally invested in something. He built the Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago in the late 2000s, and here again, banks required that he would be personally invested to a high degree, and that's exactly what happened. It is also noteworthy that it wasn't just any bank that made this deal with him. It was, in fact, Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank had a famous role in the 2008 financial crisis, so that suggests that perhaps the only way that he got this loan in the first place, any amount of a loan, even though he was personally supporting a lot of the loan, even more of it was supported by Deutsche Bank. And so the only way that he could get a bank to even do that is to go to a bank that maybe has some questionable history of decision making. And indeed, it does seem like maybe their past record of questionable decision making reflected on the next round of decisions they made, in particular giving a loan to Trump for this building project, because yet again, he did not pay his loans on time. And in fact, in this particular case, although I believe there was like some restructuring of his debts and so on, because he this time was personally invested in the project, he seemed to somewhat obliquely suggest that he probably lost money on the entire thing. He tried to present that as if it was some kind of a gift to Chicago, but if we're talking about his skill as a businessman, well, this does not seem to indicate it. He seems to, spend too much on his building projects. And so this was the state of his fortunes in the 2010s, and that is about the time when he started hosting The Apprentice. Given all of this timeline, it's reasonable to guess that perhaps the whole reason why he hosted The Apprentice is that it took no investment from him. He did not have to ask anybody for a loan, and he could get some income to pay off his already outstanding debts. And it seems, as far as, anyone can tell, The Apprentice is really where he actually started making serious money, other than possibly through this suggested cheating of his loans, which itself is a source of income that wouldn't really count as good at business. But, besides that, he seems to get a good chunk of his income, at least, from The Apprentice and not from business deals. And so this has been a long list of facts that I think if one wants to be a good skeptic, then one should pay attention to these facts because they come from many very solid sources, a lot of testimony and accounts from people who interacted with Trump, from reporters who were making statements and publishing articles on things that could absolutely be cross-verified by other investigators. So this is a good source of information, And I think it tells a pretty damning story about Trump and the question of whether or not he was a good businessman. And yet I still expect that, Trump loyalists will not respond very rationally to this information. They have a long record of never doing so. So they will deny that Trump is not a Christian. They will deny that he lies more than any other politician. They will deny that ICE, under his administration, is arresting unprecedented numbers of legal citizens and also arresting harmless immigrants, but not arresting significantly more harmful criminals. They will deny that January 6th was an insurrection, a violent attack on our capital, and that Trump is corrupt and using his power to enrich himself while simply claiming that he is working for the people, even though there are mountains of evidence from perfectly good sources attesting to every single one of these. And look, am I advocating for any particular ideology? Am I advocating for any particular policy? Do I talk about, political ideas here? No, you should not think that you know my politics because of the points that I've made here. In fact, I think a lot of people would guess my politics wrong if they tried to on the basis of this. I'm not really making a political point. I'm making a point about us getting our facts, sharing agreed upon facts, about trusting good sources so that we at least have a baseline of knowing what's going on in the world before we get to the point where we want to talk about what do we do about it and what kinds of policies we think are appropriate to address the problems that we face. I am arguing for good skepticism so that we understand these things that are going on and don't reject out of hand important, good sources of information.